One of the things that I wanted to at least we address in storytelling is that the way that storytelling is taught often, even in university settings, is a three-part act. And we're going to get into a more advanced way of thinking of how indigenous people actually tell stories already. And it really goes into the complexity of a story is beyond just the characters themselves. For example, let me share my screen here with you all. So in this process, the traditional three-act play is this act one introduction where you set up the characters and they're going. And a lot of times there's a reason why this was developed. And, many people might even say that this has started in Hollywood. And, in Hollywood, they set up the story with a character, and then they introduce the character, and it actually has a rising action in act two, some type of confrontation, and then at act three there's a crisis and some type of resolution. And this is really very common in Hollywood, and you could argue perhaps that it is because Hollywood was built by immigrants, people in there that had no tie to the land or the thing. But you could also argue too that it was a more Western thought. And if you get into literature, the character in the 18th century writings also became much stronger. Even Socrates talks about the difference between action and character, and how the character was less important than the action. And this older way of thinking, of understanding that the identity of an individual is only a piece of the whole story, is more of an indigenous way of thinking. And so we move it to where the bookends now are beat one and beat five. And this is introduced by Pauline Clogg, and she's out of Australia. She's an indigenous person out there that wrote about this. And it really follows a lot of things. And I've had the pleasure of talking to her when I was showing some work at Imaginative, and she sent me this. When we discuss these kind of principles, she wrote a paper on it. And she's an amazing storyteller, filmmaker, and academic herself. And in beat one, you introduce the land and theory. And we're going to do this workshop today is I'm just going to introduce the ideas and turn you loose to start to get into a group, talk about your stories, and then you guys are going to work on that story together and fill in these beats. And you'll find that if you have a template, filling in beats are actually quite easy. And so the introduction of one introduces the setup of the country. What country meaning, like the area of the land, indigenous nations, countries for a different term. Some people call it tribal land or Indian country, whatever term you prefer. These nations have place and cultures, and they built the relationship between the indigenous population there. The stories and the land were all part of the narrative. And you introduce the land and themes and that in beat one. And then when you move into beat two, that's when the traditional character pops in that setup. And then there's that journey. And then beat four goes into that crisis, and then in beat five, you actually get the land back into balance. And so if you see these traditional stories told by elders, especially in the oral tradition, this happens all the time. They tell you about this stuff. And in this 5-beat article on the website, it's 6 pages long. It's quite worth your time to read 6 pages to understand this. Will make you better at writing grants. It'll make you better at making your arguments in a room full of people, explaining the importance of the situation beyond the individual character. So let me break that down into how that would play out with the difference between the Western thought and the indigenous thought of a narrative. And I just put some basic personal stories together on this beat 5, but we're going to review these beats in the lesson as we work together to fill out beat 1 of the country and the themes, the beat 2, the introduction of character and story, and then the journey in beat 3, and beat 4, the resolution of the character, which is typically the third act of the traditional Western world. But with beat 5, which is a very important one for indigenous communities, it moves into that thinking of character and land and the balance with one another. And so who we are, let me explain that in this process to me. So like if they made a movie, if some Western style Hollywood person came and made a movie about me, they might say that I met a girl and she was Cherokee too, and she had a Cherokee parent like I did, and a white parent like I did. And we met and we fell in love and we had a baby and we lived happily ever after. And that's kind of the theme of a lot of movies. So this is like the Western style of thought. But if you get into more in-depth thought, maybe you add the greater idea of a lack, like the broader than a nuclear family concept. So we bring in grandma, and grandma, she grew up, she was born before she was a U.S. citizen. So she was a Cherokee that wasn't, when she was born, she had to become a U.S. citizen later, because her and my grandfather both were born before that time. And so this was her before she passed with our son. And but maybe you get into the idea of the tradition of how grandma and what she cooked and some of the traditional foods. And now we're starting to get more into these kind of concepts. And so if you're having trouble with the idea of the narratives of what you talk about in the land, one of the great things is, what does the community eat? What do they actually harvest? What's the relationship with the land? And foods and traditions that happen around them are often very common. So this is not only what my grandmas do, it's what a lot of grandmas do around here. And it gets into the idea of like the 7 generation of understanding of how we actually involve with the land and the greater meaning of our story to our people, our community, how it grows, and then the balance of that as we continue on. It makes a much better story. And so I argue this is that there's a decline in Western narratives with the anti-hero, which means like we follow these heroes like in Breaking Bad or Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where they're characters that are actually just degrading in character. And you see that with reality TV and such. And so I believe in my personal work that telling better narratives of balance is what we really have to do to help heal all of this. Is that the degrade of that gives us, a very sick society of unhealthy people treating the earth really bad, with community without understanding that there are rivers and places that we need to protect. And it gives us this lack of understanding that our narratives are built upon place. And how do we build this in a narrative? And so this is a piece of my story, but I want to talk to you a little bit about a map that I built for you guys. In this 5-beat structure that you guys are going to do right now, is the first part of this workshop, you're going to get into groups and you're going to work on these group boards, and we'll show you how to do that in a moment. And you're going to just fill in the idea after you talk to your group. So basically you're going to all tell a story. So what I did when I first got out of grad school is I would go into communities and teach animation, and we would do traditional stories, and the kids would animate them and do the voices. But before we could start to work on the project, people actually had to come in there and tell their own story. And so for these 9 and 10-year-olds that I first started working with, they had to go out and ask their grandparents or a community person or their parents stories. And then they came in and told the stories. And what that really did is it brought the community a little bit closer to understanding each other. And then they had to kind of come to a consensus. Let's just tell this story. And so although we can't tell everyone's story, the process of this workshop is really not whether your story is made, but is whether you worked on a story and you're able to actually work with the mapping and get the tools so that you can build more stories. Because we also understand there's sensitivity to stories. Certain stories will remain within community. Certain aspects will remain in community, and that's fine too. But there's always something that can be shared upon these beats 1 and beats 5. So we'll move into these in the story as we move on to, let me share my screen. Let me stop for just 2 seconds and share my map with you guys. I'm gonna open this up here. One moment, share. So I made this really quick in layers, and Cynthia will go over this in a minute, but you build different aspects of your beats and you can do multiples in there. So when you're starting to come up with beat one, there might not just be one thing. So this being about Cherokee water, I talk about traditional fishing ways, traditional practice of prayer in water. And so I go over those, and then I introduce characters and a little bit about them through song and voice and in beat two. And then I get into like beat three, which is the climax. And for Cherokees, you know, we got removed. There were some highlights in some of the process because there's ups and downs in the story arc. For example, we built universities when we came in, but then statehood happened. And then, you know, the Great Depression, we lost a lot of people in the Dust Bowl. And then we move into them damming up the rivers and starting to pollute the waters. And so in beat three, a lot of stuff happens. And then we get into the resolution. Cherokee Nation starts to become more economically powerful, more political, and then starts doing environmental programs. And then we start to get into the idea that we're starting to train young people again in these processes. And so this is a real quick overview of this map. And in this process, I have stories, I have links to YouTube videos of going to water. I have little links to other